In the scorching, relentless heat of the sun, in the middle of the ocean, with no shore in sight, Michael found himself stuck. He was on the brink of passing out and giving up. But then something changed. Michael knew he had to do something, and so he made an impossible decision. And that was the last time anyone saw Michael Rockefeller. Welcome to Fridays with Tony, where we explore mysteries that are unusual, unsettling, and often unsolved. I'm Tony, and every other Friday we have thrilling tales to delve into with you. Like and subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified when a new story is posted. This week, we're uncovering a story involving a family whose name has been well known worldwide since the days of the Industrial Revolution. Let's go back to the late 1950s, a time when America was booming. The Rockefellers were practically royalty, and one young man, born into all of it, decided he wanted out. Not out of the money or the family, but out of the expectations. That young man was Michael Clark Rockefeller. With a name like Rockefeller, you'd assume boardrooms, political ambitions, and maybe a life behind the velvet ropes of New York's elite. But Michael, born on May 18, 1938, was never wired that way. He was the youngest child of Nelson Rockefeller, then New York's governor and future vice president of the United States. And that made him the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate who practically minted modern American capitalism. From the outside, everything looked textbook perfect. Michael was smart, athletic, and respectful. Everything a Rockefeller heir was expected to be. When he got to Harvard, he earned his degree in history and economics with honors. He ticked all the boxes. But those close to him noticed something off script. While others in his family lit up at the mention of investments, political deals, or city planning, Michael's gaze wandered elsewhere, somewhere far more remote. There was one place that quietly started to shift his direction, and it wasn't a school or a family estate. It was a museum. In 1957, Nelson Rockefeller, Michael Rockefeller's father, opened the Museum of Primitive Art in New York. It focused on tribal artworks from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, cultures usually left out of mainstream museums. For Michael, it wasn't just interesting, it was magnetic. The carved masks, elaborate shields, and totemic figures opened up a completely different universe. And it wasn't just about admiring the pieces behind glass. He actually wanted to understand the people behind them. By his early 20s, Michael had become a trustee of the museum, and that tells you something. He wasn't there for appearances. He was deeply involved. He and his father bonded over this shared fascination with indigenous art. But while Nelson was content collecting it, Michael wanted to go, see, and learn. And that's when the path started to split. While still at Harvard, Michael got involved with the Peabody Museum, which had its eye on an expedition to one of the last truly untapped corners of the world, Netherlands, New Guinea. Back then, the western half of New Guinea was still under Dutch control. It was wild and isolated. The kind of place where Stone Age traditions were still part of everyday life. Most people wouldn't even consider going, but for Michael, it wasn't just attractive, he knew that he needed to go. Then, in 1960, something shifted again. Michael had just finished a brief stint in the U.S. Army. He was only 21, but when the Peabody Museum's expedition came calling, he didn't hesitate. He joined as a sound recordist and photographer for a documentary film project. The mission was to film the ritual warfare of the Dani people in the remote Baliem Valley, under the leadership of filmmaker Robert Gardner. Now here's where it gets wild. The Dani were unlike anything Michael had ever seen. Clans with feathers in their hair, wielding spears, engaging in mock battles that mimicked warfare, but carried deep ritual meaning. These were windows into a worldview few outsiders ever witnessed. Michael didn't just capture the Dani on film, he actually embedded himself In one now famous photograph, he crouches low with a 35mm camera, completely surrounded by Dani tribesmen, curious eyes on him, the only foreigner in sight. The resulting film, Dead Birds, became an iconic piece of ethnographic cinema. But for Michael, it was more than that. It awakened something deep in him, a craving for discovery. But not just new lands. He wanted to discover understanding. He later described it in words that almost feel prophetic. It's the desire to do something adventurous at a time when frontiers, in the real sense of the word, are disappearing. Think about that. In the 20th century, while the rest of the world was rushing towards technology, speed, and structure, Michael was running backward toward mystery, culture, and the last unknowns on the map. But that wasn't the end of the trip. In fact, that's when things started to take a darker, more complicated turn. While the rest of the expedition focused on the highlands, Michael couldn't stop thinking about something they had only briefly touched: the Asmat people. This was a coastal group, feared and misunderstood, known for their astonishingly intricate wood carvings and warrior traditions. Michael had only visited a few villages and traded for spears and shields, but the impression was unforgettable. He wrote home calling the Asmat a huge puzzle. He wanted to solve it. He wanted to learn their stories, understand their spiritual systems, trace the lineage of their art. Every shield and drum, every carved figure was a clue, and Michael wanted to piece it together. But the deeper you dig, the more tangled the web becomes. The Asmat weren't simply artists. Their culture was steeped in ritual, spiritual symbolism, and traditions that were often deeply confrontational to outside understanding. To the Western eye, their customs could seem brutal, but to Michael they were sacred, and the only way to learn them was to return. You'd think at this point someone in his family would step in and say, "Enough." But Michael wasn't reckless. He was determined. During the Harvard expedition, he had proved himself over and over. He wasn't a pampered tourist. He worked hard, adapted quickly, and built trust where others couldn't. When some team members chose to retreat to safety, Michael went further into the unknown. The seed had been planted. He had found his calling. It was 1961, and Michael Rockefeller had just returned from the highlands of New Guinea. He came back changed and wasn't even thinking about legacy or luxury. He was thinking about the Asmat because he wasn't done with New Guinea. If anything, he was just getting started. Back in New York, he joined the board of his father's Museum of Primitive Art. But instead of sitting back, nodding politely through meetings, he wanted to go back to Asmat territory all alone. But why? To collect art, yes, but also to understand. He wasn't just planning a museum trip, he was preparing for a descent into the unknown. The Asmat were more than just talented woodcarvers. Their besige poles, massive vertical structures carved from mangrove trees, were spiritual tools and markers of death and vengeance. Each one honored an ancestor whose spirit was still restless. And according to Asmat beliefs, the only way to quiet that spirit was with balance. That balance often came in the form of retaliation through blood. Michael knew this. He read about it, studied it, and still he was captivated. To him, the Asmat weren't relics of a dying culture. They were brilliant, present, and complex. They weren't savages, one writer would later say of Michael's view, but men with the minds and hands to fly a 747. Michael didn't look at them as curiosities. He looked at them as equals, just living by a different script. In the fall of 1961, Michael Rockefeller stepped off a plane and into the thick, wet breath of Netherlands, New Guinea. This wasn't a place where maps were useful. Colonial rule was slipping. Indonesia wanted control. The Dutch were holding on. And in the middle of it all were villages that still remembered old wars and old wounds. It was the very edge of the known world, and Michael had come to meet it. He stationed himself in Agats, a tiny coastal outpost surrounded by mangrove forests and waterlogged soil. There were no roads or real towns, just stilt houses, slow rivers, and an endless hum of insects. He wasn't alone, though. The Dutch assigned a young anthropologist named René Wassing to accompany him. 2 teenage boys from the Asmat joined them as interpreters and guides. Their boat, a narrow wooden craft, became their lifeline, vehicle, and home. From the boat, Michael entered a world few outsiders ever saw. One minute he'd be navigating narrow river channels, shaded by thick jungle. The next, he'd arrive at a village where the sight of a white man still sparked stunned silence. At times, women and children vanished at the sound of his motor. Men would appear, faces streaked in white chalk, bodies adorned with boar tusks, watching him, unblinking. But Michael had a way. He smiled, offered tobacco, and sometimes shared food. And slowly, the silence broke. In these villages, Michael didn't act like a collector. He acted like a student. He sat in smoky longhouses, cross-legged, listening to chants and stories he barely understood. He tasted sago pudding, watched elders trace symbols into the mud, and traded steel axes, cloth, fishing hooks, and even mirrors. In return, he received a treasure trove: ornate drums, ceremonial shields, bamboo horns, and those rare, towering Basij poles. Some of the poles stood 15 to 20 feet tall, carved in one solid piece from mangrove trees, their base shaped from the roots. They weren't just decorative, they told stories and held power. In Asmat culture, a Basij pole wasn't carved unless someone had died unjustly. Each one meant something was unsettled, and until a death was avenged, the pole stood tall, watching. Michael knew what these carvings represented, and still, he collected them. He was careful and respectful, but always curious. Over weeks, he visited at least 13 villages, some of which had never before seen a white outsider. He didn't just take objects, he documented everything. He photographed daily life, captured rituals, and made notes on every piece. He was building a map instead of a mere gallery, a visual record of a culture standing at the edge of contact and change. And he kept going. By November, his boat was weighed down with dozens of carvings. One Dutch official even joked it might sink under the sheer weight of primitive art. Michael laughed it off. But he wasn't done. Not yet. There was one place that called to him more than any other. Otschnep was a large village, deep in the Asmat region, known for its carvings, Basij poles, and warriors, and unknown to Michael, known for something else too: a bitter, lingering resentment. Otschnep had a reputation, not just for its size and artistry, but for its history. Years before, Dutch colonial authorities had punished the village harshly for a violent raid. Guns were used, lives were lost, and the wound hadn't healed. To Michael, it was another opportunity to study brilliance, but beneath that surface, something was brewing. It began like any other humid morning in the tropics. Silent, still, the kind of heat that clings to your skin before the sun even rises above the mangroves. But for Michael Rockefeller, November 17, 1961 was not just another day. It was the beginning of something final, something irreversible. He didn't know it yet, but every movement he made from the moment he stepped into that canoe was part of a countdown. Michael and René Wassing stood at the edge of the village of Pur, staring out over the wide, brackish mouth of the Betz River, where it collided with the tidal power of the Arafura Sea. Their vessel, a 40-foot dugout canoe converted into a makeshift catamaran with twin outboard motors and pontoon outriggers, bobbed patiently in the water. It wasn't elegant, but it was sturdy. At least they hoped. Dutch patrol officer Wim van de Waal had sold the boat to Michael just weeks earlier, and it had carried them well so far. Now it was fully loaded. artifacts carefully wrapped and tucked away, extra fuel tied down, supplies for the next leg of their journey stacked neatly. Simon and Leo, two Asmat teens, joined them as navigators, and the plan was clear: cross the river mouth and make their way down to the southern villages near Otschenep. But the river had its own agenda. As the canoe pushed off, the water seemed calm, glassy and warm under the early light. The sky hung low with moisture, the air unmoving. Yet somewhere beyond the visible edge of the world, winds were gathering, and they were moving fast. What began as a quiet crossing turned violent with little warning. A squall swept in, churning the surface of the Arafura Sea into whitecaps. Waves slammed into the canoe, water lashed over the pontoons, and within moments, the motors sputtered out, drowned by a sudden surge. The balance shifted and then broke. A single, enormous wave struck the side of the catamaran with brutal precision, and it flipped. Just like that, everything they had was in the water. Cargo, supplies, radio, fuel. Everything was gone. Michael and Wassing surfaced, coughing seawater, stunned by how fast their world had inverted. The canoe now floated upside down, its belly to the sky. They clung to it, kicking to keep afloat. And while they scrambled to hold on, Simon and Leo made a decision. The boys, strong swimmers born to this water, knew there was no time to waste. The nearest shoreline was distant, miles away. But they believed they could make it. Without waiting, they struck out, arms slicing through the sea, hoping to reach land and bring help. Michael and Wassing watched them go until they disappeared into the vast blur of waves and mangroves. It was the last time they would see them. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. The equatorial heat baked them, and their skin began to blister, and their lips cracked. The sea, endless and indifferent, rocked them gently as the current carried them farther from where they had started. The horizon didn't change. No land grew closer, and no rescue appeared. Back on shore, however, something was happening. Simon and Leo did make it. After an exhausting swim, they crawled onto land, but getting help wasn't instant. The route to the Dutch post at Agats meant a long, muddy, disorienting march through a dense, unforgiving jungle. It took them until nearly midnight, soaked, barefoot, scratched, and bruised, but they made it. The alarm was raised, and authorities in Agats scrambled at once. By dawn on November 18th, helicopters and planes were in the sky. Boats set out from coastal stations. Orders were issued. Search grids were drawn. A squadron of P-2V Neptune aircraft, equipped with radar sensitive enough to detect a floating coconut, began to comb the waters. But Michael and Wassing had already drifted. That second day at sea was brutal, and every muscle ached. Their bodies were raw, sun-scorched, and their minds dulled by dehydration and panic. They had tied themselves to the hull during the night, knowing how easily sleep or a wave could separate them forever. They made it through the darkness, but the morning brought no rescue, just more ocean and more silence. And then Michael made a decision. He was 23 years old. His father was the governor of New York. His last name opened doors in every corner of the world, but none of that mattered out here. Out here, survival was earned, not inherited. "I think I can make it," he said to Wassing. His voice was cracked from thirst, but his tone was steady. Wassing, exhausted and unsure, urged him to stay. They were safer together. Help had to be coming. But Michael shook his head. If they waited too long, the current might pull them further out to sea. The mangroves were visible now, just a smudge of green on the horizon. Land was there. 10 miles, maybe less. It was far, but not impossible. He made a plan. Michael took 2 empty gasoline jerry cans from the wreckage and tied them to his waist for flotation. He stripped down to his underwear, less drag. He kept a small knife tied to his side and grabbed a piece of wood for a paddle. It was crude, improvised, and dangerous, but it was the only shot he saw. Michael Rockefeller lowered himself into the water and began to swim. For a few tense minutes, Renee Wassing could still see him, just ahead, cutting slowly across the glimmering water. I could see him clearly at first, Wassing would later say. He was swimming in a straight line, until I just saw 3 dots. 2 cans, and his head. Then silence. The dots drifted smaller, then nothing. They vanished against the horizon, swallowed by light and water. Now Wassing was alone, clinging to the upturned hull of a wrecked canoe in the middle of the Arafura Sea. No land in sight, no sound but the gentle slapping of waves against the wood. The sun had begun its slow descent across the sky, and the air had turned sharp with salt and heat. Hours passed with nothing but the endless, indifferent sea stretching in every direction. But then, something flickered on the edge of the horizon. A Neptune patrol plane, part of the rapidly intensifying search effort, flew overhead that afternoon, around 4:30 p.m. One of the crew members spotted the pale shape of the overturned canoe. More importantly, they saw movement. Wassing, waving weakly, holding on. They immediately radioed his position, but time was slipping. The sun was dipping low, and night in New Guinea fell fast and hard. A Dutch rescue boat was dispatched to those coordinates, but by the time it reached the area, darkness had already swallowed the sea. The rescue would have to wait. It wasn't until the following morning, November 20th, that Rene Wassing was finally pulled from the water. Sunburned, dehydrated, and emotionally shattered. He had survived nearly 3 days at sea, but his mind was fixed on one thought: Michael. He told the search team everything about the swim, about the jerry cans, about the moment he lost sight of his companion. And with that, a quiet disappearance exploded into an international crisis, because this wasn't just any missing man. This was Michael Rockefeller, the 23-year-old son of Nelson Rockefeller, the powerful governor of New York and a future vice president of the United States. The moment his name was attached to the incident, everything changed. The Dutch colonial government, aware of the attention now fixed on their remote outpost, mobilized every available resource. Helicopters buzzed low over the swamps. Planes scanned the sea from above. Naval patrols fanned out along the coastline and river mouths. Thousands of local Papuans, fishermen, villagers, and tribal guides joined the effort, paddling their canoes through tangled mangroves, eyes scanning for any clue. A red jerry can, a piece of fabric, anything. But the sea and the jungle gave up nothing. Days stretched on. The search widened. And then, on November 24th, a sleek chartered plane touched down on New Guinea's remote southern coast. Inside was Nelson Rockefeller himself, accompanied by his daughter Mary, Michael's twin. The most powerful man in New York had flown halfway across the world, now visibly aged, pale, and strained beneath the oppressive tropical heat. Reporters swarmed as he stepped onto the runway, his suit damp with sweat. He had a press conference in Morocco, speaking calmly but urgently. He offered rewards. He offered reassurances. "I simply want to be here," he said, "if Michael is found." The official search lasted for more than a week, though by the 6th day, even the most optimistic began to whisper doubts. By early December, the effort wound down. Planes returned to their hangars, boats docked, and reports were filed. Michael Rockefeller had vanished without a trace. In 1964, 3 years after his disappearance, he was declared legally dead. The presumed cause was drowning. And yet, for those who had been to New Guinea, for those who understood the depth and secrecy of the Asmat region, that explanation never sat quite right. Something about it felt too convenient. The Arafura Sea was treacherous, yes, the swim was risky, but Michael was fit, determined, and prepared. He had flotation, he had direction, and he had been less than 10 miles from the shore, a brutal distance, but not impossible. People started asking, what if he did make it to shore? So what really happened? One of the earliest rumors was the most romantic. Maybe Michael had simply chosen to disappear after seeing something out there in the jungle, in the raw, visceral world of the Asmat, that had called to him more deeply than anything back home. What if he hadn't died at all? What if he had gone native? It was the kind of idea that caught fire in the public imagination, the billionaire's son, casting off civilization to live among the so-called savages. But there were darker stories too. Stories that didn't make it into the newspapers. Because while the official stance remained firm, drowning, no doubt about it, whispers were coming from the jungle that painted a far more disturbing picture. Whispers the Dutch authorities didn't want to chase, and the Rockefeller family quietly chose not to pursue. Just weeks after the search was called off, a Catholic missionary stationed in the region, Father Cornelius van Kessel, began hearing things. His parishioners, Asmat villagers, spoke in hushed tones. They told him something that sent chills down his spine. A white man had been seen swimming toward shore, alone. This was not a rumor or a ghost. This was a living, breathing figure, nearly naked, struggling through the waves. The sighting happened near the village of Otsjanep. According to the stories, a group of Asmat hunters had pulled the man from the water, confused, half-drowned, exhausted, but alive. The villagers had argued about what to do. Some recognized him as the same foreigner who had visited weeks earlier, the one who brought steel tools, tobacco, cloth, gifts, in exchange for their sacred carvings. He had been generous, respectful, even curious. They remembered that, but not everyone saw kindness in his return, because Otsjanep had a history, one marked by blood. A few years earlier, Dutch colonial forces had stormed the area in response to an Asmat raid on a neighboring village. Shots were fired, men were killed, and justice, as seen by the outsiders, had been served. But to the Asmat, those deaths were a wound that never healed. In their culture, when blood is shed, balance must be restored. Spirits cry out for vengeance, and sometimes that vengeance comes in the form of a symbolic act, ritualistic, spiritual, and for outsiders, almost incomprehensible. So the question lingered. If the stories were true, if Michael had reached the shore, was he met with hospitality or with justice? The missionary, troubled by what he heard, reported these stories to Dutch authorities, but little was done. The official line remained unchanged, lost at sea, nothing more. Pursuing an alternative meant opening up cultural wounds, possibly inflaming tensions, and, most crucially, suggesting that one of the world's most prominent families had lost their son not to nature, but to ritual. For 3 long years, that balance hung unresolved. Visage poles, towering, haunting carvings stacked with ancestral forms, stood in silent witness, promising revenge. But vengeance didn't need to fall on the men who fired the guns. In Asmat belief, the spiritual debt could be settled by any outsider, anyone who shared their skin tone, anyone who came from the world that had brought violence. And then on the morning of November 20th, 1961, an opportunity appeared. As the story goes, a group of Otsjanep men were paddling home near the mouth of the Etwa River at dawn when they saw him, a lone white figure, weak and trembling, dragging himself from the water onto the shore. It was a moment heavy with meaning. Karl Hoffman, the writer who would later retrace this entire mystery, believed it was this exact moment where everything changed. Not just for Michael, but for the Asmat too. To them, Michael wasn't just another visitor. For the first time, he was alone. He had no crew, no protection, no power. And in that vulnerability, something shifted. To me, Hoffman would write, the moment they speared him was a moment of retaking their own power and self-esteem and identity. Because if what followed was true, it wasn't an act of random brutality. It was something older, colder, sacred. Missionary Father Cornelius van Kessel and Brother Hubertus von Page were stationed nearby in the months following Michael's disappearance. The stories they heard from their Asmat parishioners weren't just whispers. They were detailed, specific, and horrifying. Michael did make it to shore. He was recognized immediately. A few argued for sparing his life, but others remembered the 5 fallen leaders. names still spoken with reverence, still owed justice. And so, the obligation was invoked. The testimonies later detailed in Dutch reports describe what happened next. Michael was stabbed, first, a non-lethal wound to his ribs or stomach, just enough to immobilize him. He was then dragged to the banks of the Jawar River. There, in the shade of the jungle, surrounded by nearly 50 Asmat men, he was ritually killed. What happened after was not chaos. It was a ceremony. In Asmat culture, the killing of an enemy initiates a sacred process. The body is dismembered, the head taken, the flesh consumed. Bones become daggers, tools, and sacred objects. Strength is transferred, spirits are released. And for those 5 fallen men from 1958, the doorway to Safan, the land of the dead, was finally opened. Balance had been restored. Father Van Kessel and Brother Von Page both sent letters to their superiors in late 1961 detailing what they'd learned. They even named 5 men believed to be responsible, all directly tied to the original victims from the 1958 raid. But this story never made it to the public. Why? Because in 1961, the Dutch were under pressure. They were desperate to prove to the United Nations that they were capable of managing West Papua responsibly, that the region was pacified and stable. An American heir being cannibalized on their watch would unravel that image. It would damage their position in the global arena. And Nelson Rockefeller, Michael's father, wasn't just grieving. He was a political figure, a power broker, and a potential future president. Any suggestion that his son had been ritually killed in a jungle ceremony could have upended diplomatic relations. So the Dutch made a decision. Foreign Minister Joseph Luns personally told Nelson that the rumors were false. Official documents stated nothing had been found. But internally, Dutch colonial officers knew differently. One memo in late 1961 admitted that word of Michael's violent death had reached the government, but that it was deemed politically sensitive and suppressed. Then came March 1962. The Associated Press published a shocking article suggesting that Michael had been killed and cannibalized. The Dutch and the Rockefeller family denied it immediately. But behind the scenes, the Dutch sent out a quiet mission. An investigation led by none other than Wim van de Wall, the man who had sold Michael his canoe. Van de Wall traveled to Oostgeneep and returned with something chilling, a skull. The skull was missing its lower jaw and had a puncture in the temple, classic signs of a headhunting ritual. Van de Wall handed it over, suspecting it might be Michael's. But no DNA test was ever performed, no written report was ever filed, and once again the story was buried. Still, the rumors didn't die. In 1969, American journalist Milt Macklin flew to New Guinea on a mission of his own. He interviewed missionaries, Dutch officials, and Asmat villagers. He found no proof that Michael was alive, but he came away convinced that Michael had been killed upon reaching shore. He'd even heard stories of early confessions. In the 1970s, artist-anthropologist Tobias Scheenbaum said he'd been told by Oostgeneep villagers that they had eaten a white man in the early 1960s. In 1979, an unverified story surfaced that Michael's mother had sent a private investigator to New Guinea and that he returned with 3 skulls, one of which he believed belonged to Michael. It was claimed a $250,000 reward was paid in exchange, but no confirmation ever came. Then, in the early 2010s, Carl Hoffman picked up the trail. He traveled repeatedly to the Asmat region, building trust, asking careful questions and showing old photos. Over time, elderly villagers began to talk. One, named Amatas, described the killing in extraordinary detail. Another performed an eerie pantomime on the riverbank, acting out the attack while whispering cryptic words. The Tuan was killed here. He told Hoffman never to speak of it again. In 2014, Hoffman published Savage Harvest, a tale of cannibals, colonialism, and Michael Rockefeller's tragic quest for primitive art. The book pieced together decades of secrets. It showed how history, culture, revenge, and silence had collided on that jungle shore. Hoffman didn't speculate, he stated, Michael Rockefeller had been murdered and consumed in a ritual act of vengeance. The Dutch knew. The church knew. And perhaps the Rockefeller family knew too. But without DNA, without remains, the final proof still floats just out of reach. Just like those red jerry cans. Seen once, then never again. Thanks for joining me today. It seems that extraordinary opportunity can bring extraordinary risks, and ultimately, an extraordinary fate for Michael Rockefeller. I think today's society has become so much more respectful of other cultures. Do you think anything like this could ever happen today? Would you ever want to visit a society that is completely insulated from modern culture? They're rare, but they do still exist in the far corners of the earth. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. That's all for this week. I look forward to seeing you next time on Fridays with Tony, so please, don't disappear.